On May 24, 1920, Warren G. Harding took a stand and declared,
"America's present need is not heroic, but healing. Not nostrum, but normalcy. Not revolution, but restoration."
The future president of the United States believed in a particular political philosophy of working on the problems at home first in order to better secure the world. In order to do this, they needed to return to a time before the Great War that had just concluded in 1918. This political philosophy would be put to the test for the Harding administration, as there would be a post-war recession that would rock American lives. Warren G. Harding's return to normalcy, as described in his readjustment speech as well as others, would fuel his policy prescriptions in response to the economic recession of 1920 to 1921, and lead to a positive turn that would reveal itself as the Roaring Twenties. To understand the use of Warren G. Harding's positions and subsequent actions while president during this economic recession, one must examine the words of the man as he described his political philosophy. For the past few administrations, most notably under Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, the United States had seen a dramatic growth in the federal government's power when it came to economics. This was fueled by the ever-growing clout of philosophical progressivism, which aimed to create a better competitive battleground within the American capitalist economic system. Each individual progressive had their own flavor of the philosophy, but President Roosevelt put the position quite well when he said, quote, "It has become entirely clear that we must have government supervision of the capitalization, not only of a public service corporations, including particularly railways, but of all corporations doing an interstate business," unquote. Through this quote, one can interpret Roosevelt's attitudes to runaway big business. Roosevelt thought it was the job of government to supervise these corporations in accordance with the public good. He needed the government to step in order to create a fair capitalist system. Whereas Roosevelt and his two successors were skeptical of big business, Harding was very skeptical of big government. He had a resistance to empowering the government any further, and desired to rein in these expansions that had taken place over the past three administrations, especially under Wilson. He had growing concern, as he laid out in several speeches in 1920, as to the growing expansion of the executive branch specifically. In his acceptance speech at the Republican Party nominee for president given on July 22, 1920, Harding described the government under Woodrow Wilson during World War I as an autocracy, rather than a democracy. There had been a massive use of federal expansion during World War I in order to fuel the efforts. One such example is the massive hike in taxes that had never been seen before. The implementation of an income tax was considered unconstitutional up until 1913. With the passing of the 16th Amendment, this would change. Even then, the top marginal tax rate was only 7%, and very few Americans actually paid this. With the United States entering World War I in 1917, there needed to be the necessary funds in order to participate. The Revenue Act of 1917 jumped the top marginal rate up to 67%. With the Revenue Act of 1918, this, again, jumped it in 1918 to 77%. Harding disagreed with this as he wanted to, quote, "put an end to false economics which lure humanity to utter chaos," unquote. He conceded that perhaps in a time of alarm this transfer of power was necessary. The specific instance he was referring to was the need to get involved in World War I. Now that the war had ended, he claimed that, quote, "Our alarm is over. The failure to restore the constitutional methods when the war emergency ended was troubling. It was time to revise economic policies to reflect the peacetime." He continued in other speeches to describe the current federal government as a one-man government, and that the founders would never have approved this. As senator in Ohio, he explained in one speech that the government is made up of normal men, not supermen. The only difference is that the men in government are given a massive amount of responsibility. This country was built not from the decisions of a one-man government or of a superman at the top, but instead by communities, farms, and citizens working in cooperation with each other at the bottom. He believed that in order for this country to move forward, the citizens must trust in the, quote, "righteousness of intelligent public opinion, not in the glory of the Superman," unquote. Reeling the government power in and giving the Congress and the regular citizens the power again were the values that the return to normalcy would provide if he were to become president. In January of 1920, a significant downturn set in the U.S. economy and would last until July of 1921. This would follow the end of World War I, with the government no longer sending massive amount of money, men, and resources overseas. These men now were coming home, and this dramatically shifted the economy. Over the next few months, real GNP fell by 15%, industrial production fell by 23%, and the unemployment rate rose. In 1919, the number of unemployed was about 950,000. In 1920, that number rose to 1,670,000. In 1921, the unemployment had risen to 5,010,000. That is a total increase of 4,060,000 people. To put that into perspective, the unemployment rose by 6,470,000 between 1929 and 1931 during the start of the Great Depression. In total, the early 1920s depression saw a net increase of unemployment by about 8%. Producer prices fell by 40.8%, stock prices fell by 46.6%, and corporate profits fell by 92%. According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, net income of all reporting corporations in 1920 was $5.874 billion, but only $458 million in 1921. The economy was in an overall downturn. Harding himself would remain largely unblamed during the time of the downturn. In fact, it was his Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, who was the face of the crisis. The most significant of this being the rising unemployment rate. William Morris, a political cartoonist, would express this by creating a cartoon of Hoover spoon-feeding a fat man labeled unemployment. The nation was seeing this depression as a serious problem and were intent on blaming someone. Harding had an agenda he had been promising his constituents when he took office in order to fix the economy. If Harding achieved his goals, what would follow would be a dramatic reining in of the budget. In a speech of his, he stated, quote, "The annual expenses of the federal government can be reduced hundreds of millions of dollars without impairing the efficiency of the public services," unquote. Another would be the goal of reducing taxes, as stated before. He was not completely laissez-faire, however. He believed the government should act by installing tariffs, creating a Department of Public Welfare, and massively restricting immigration. A few of these policy prescriptions would become reality. On May 27, 1921, Harding signed an emergency tariff which would be applied to wheat, corn, meat, wool, and sugar. The Harding administration would also sign into law the Budget and Accounting Act. This required the president to present a reasonable budget that would balance, and this made the reining in of government spending a reality, something that was not seen since before the United States entered World War I. Immigration quotas were also put in place. Harding was unable to create his Department of Welfare, and tax reform was delayed in the first year of his administration. These would not stop the economy from reacting to the legislation that Republican majority Congress passed, however. By July of 1921, the economic downturn would reverse itself, and the American economy would start growing again. From 1921 to 1922, industrial production grew by 25.9%. Real income per capita grew by about 5.9%. In 1920, reporting American corporations showed a net profit of about $5.9 billion. This went down to $458 million as stated previously. By 1922, when the economy was turning around under the Harding administration's policies, the American corporations reported a net profit of $4.8 billion. In 1920, the number of unemployed rose to 1.67 million. In 1921, the unemployment rate had risen to 5,010,000. By 1922, unemployment reduced to 3.22 million. In 1923, unemployment continued to decrease down to 1.38 million. That shows about a net employment and creation of 3.36 million jobs in the United States. The policies of normalcy seem to have driven a net positive outcome in such a way that it had led the recovery of the American economy. There is a legitimate argument to be made that this could have developed from a Wilson-led economy, since Woodrow Wilson was president during the majority of this recession. Harding only entered office 4 months before the economy started recovering. Wilson was in office 14 months longer than Harding, so one must examine the actions by the Wilson administration taken at this time in order to properly analyze this economic downturn. Wilson, unfortunately, suffered a stroke on October 2nd, 1919. This had led the president to be quite incapable of promoting or creating any sort of prominent fiscal legislation. The downturn would start in January of 1920. The only role Wilson really had during that entire year at that point was vetoing bills that Congress attempted to pass. He was so ill after this that the Democrats did not even name him as the Democratic nominee for the election. There were no major federal bills related to fiscal policy that passed while both the downturn was occurring and Wilson was president. It was instead the Harding administration who came in and started revising the fiscal policies. Following these policies, and even after Harding passed away, the American economy would see major growth. Following the new upturn in the economy, President Harding proceeded and succeeded in getting the tax reform passed of which he had so feverishly promised. On November 23, 1921, President Warren G. Harding passed the Revenue Act of 1921. This, among other things, reduced the top marginal tax rate from 73% to 58%, of those making over $200,000 a year. Before this, if one was making over $200,000, they had to pay at least 68%. If they were earning over $300,000, they had to pay 71%. If they were making over $500,000, they had to pay 72%. And if they were making over $1 million, then they would have to pay 73%. With this tax cut, the economy continued to grow. On August 2nd, 1923, President Warren G. Harding passed away due to complications from an unrecognized coronary thrombosis. The nation was in shock, as so many would realize that a new man was taking the office. President Calvin Coolidge would now be the new commander-in-chief, and Silent Cal was a big shift in personality than his predecessor. However, what they did not differ on was their politics. Both being conservative Republicans, Coolidge had continued to profess the ideals of normalcy that Harding had championed. There are many philosophical parallels that bind Harding and Coolidge. Both of them had skepticism about big government. In his speeches, Harding would constantly remind those listening that the government was not run by supermen. Coolidge would echo this by saying, quote, "It is a great advantage to a president, and a major source of safety to the country, for him to know that he is not a great man," unquote. They both had the perspective that government officials are not the answer to further prosperity. President Coolidge had been proud of the work Harding had done for the country. In his autobiography, Coolidge recalled the aftermath of the post-war Depression. He explained how, despite the fact that they had accomplished a lot in government, when he traveled the country in 1922, the regular people explained their hardship to him. Coolidge recalls, quote, "The government could and did stop the waste of the people's savings, but it could not restore them. While the country was improving, it was still depressed," unquote. There was still much work to be done. In a speech given as president on June 30th, 1924, at the meeting of the business organization of the government, Coolidge emphasized a few goals he had for further economic growth. He emphasized the need for yet further tax reform. He states, quote, "A government which lays taxes on the people not required by urgent public necessity and sound public policy is not a protector of liberty, but an instrument of tyranny," unquote. He goes on to espouse further accomplishments of Harding by saying that they were able to reduce the federal budget from $5.6 billion to less than $3.5 billion. The president explained that he wanted to continue this progressive reduction in spending. President Coolidge would go on to accomplish many of the things he wanted to. Despite the frustration of many of the citizens he had met while on speaking tours, he desired to double down, believing that his and Harding's fiscal policies would fuel a net benefit to the nation. During his tenure, the Coolidge presidency saw taxes reduced through the Revenue Act of 1924. This decreased the top marginal tax rate from 58% to 46%. Soon to follow, the Revenue Act of 1926 was passed, which decreased the top marginal tax rate from 46% to 25%. In fact, the Coolidge administration passed so many tax exemptions that approximately 98% of the population did not pay any income tax at all. Despite this loss of revenue, Coolidge was able to reduce the national debt from $22.3 billion in 1923 to $16.9 billion in 1929. Coolidge seemed to excel far beyond the standards that the former president had left.
The country needs every ounce of its energy to restore itself. The costs of government are all assessed upon the people. This means that the farmer is doomed to provide a certain amount of money out of the sale of his produce, no matter how low the price, to pay his taxes. The expenses of the government reach everybody. Taxes take from everyone a part of his earnings and force everyone to work for a certain part of his time for the government. When we come to realize that the yearly expenses of the governments of this country, the stupendous sum of about $7.5 billion, such a sum is difficult to comprehend. It represents all the pay of 5 million wage earners receiving $5 a day, working 300 days in the year. These are some of the reasons why I want to cut down public expense. I want the people of America to be able to work less for the government and more for themselves. I want them to have the rewards of their own industry. This is the chief meaning of freedom. Until we can reestablish a condition under which the earnings of the people can be kept by the people, we are bound to suffer a very severe and distinct curtailment of our liberty.
Following these federal actions, the kind of effect they would have on the economy was quite positive. Between 1922 and 1927, the American economy would grow exponentially. The production of manufactured goods climbed by 4% each year. Per capita earnings of factory employees increased by 2.4% a year. Real wages raised by 2.1% a year. Steel production rose at an annual rate of 21%. Real GNP per capita would grow from around $5,200 in 1923 up to about $5,800 by 1929. This prosperity would continue into the succeeding presidency of Herbert Hoover until the stock market crash of 1929. After looking at the prosperity brought out by the politics of normalcy, one must inevitably encounter the realization that the greatest economic downturn in history commenced soon after the Harding-Coolidge era ended, the Great Depression. Inevitably, in a capitalist economy, there are always going to be booms and busts. Sometimes blame can be placed on governments, sometimes they cannot. In many cases, the easier path presents through placing blame on those in hindsight as to what caused a particular downturn. However, a government can control what actions are taken in response. Harding responded to the Depression of 1920 to 1921 by balancing the budget, installing a tariff, and reducing taxes soon after the downturn finished. Coolidge faced two economic downturns as well in 1924 and 1927. However, these were minimal. Overall, the economy kept growing exponentially. In response to these downturns, however, he continued Harding's precedents. He reduced taxes twice and reined in government spending. Hoover was the first to deter from this standard of success. After the markets started to crash, the Revenue Act of 1932 was passed, increasing the top marginal tax rate from 25% to 63%. The national debt also increased under Hoover's presidency by about $6 billion. It had been $17 billion in debt in 1929 and had increased to $23 billion in debt in 1933. The first effort to deter from the return to normalcy saw the Great Depression worsen. The Hoover administration also passed the Hawley-Smoot tariff in June of 1930, though it's curious to wonder how the passage of this tariff somehow made the Great Depression much worse. Meanwhile, Harding's tariff did not make his recession worse. Perhaps that is one area of study that could be explored in the future. Having examined the philosophy of President Warren G. Harding's return to normalcy, one can draw the line to his policies and see how they appeared in the real world. These became highly relevant considering the Harding administration was entering power during a significant economic recession. The administering of these policies would lead to the swift resolution of the Depression of 1920 to 1921, and President Coolidge's subsequent adoption of the same philosophy and policies were what brought about the prosperity of the 1920s.